November 1939, the Winter War, unyielding resistance on the ice field, thunder on the ice, the disguised signal to start war. At 2 a.m. on November 29, 1939, the temperature on Finland's Karelian Isthmus had dropped below -35°C. The cold wind, swirling with snowflakes, cut like countless ice-forged blades across Eero Haapala's frost-purple cheeks. The chilblains on his cheekbones had split open, the oozing blood froze into tiny shards the moment it met the frigid air. This 21-year-old Finnish infantryman clutched his Mosin-Nagant rifle to his chest, its wooden stock had long turned as cold and hard as iron. He rubbed it repeatedly with gloved hands, trying to generate a trace of warmth, but the wool gloves were worn through at the fingertips, his exposed skin stuck to the rifle's metal surface, and yanking it free tore off a small patch of flesh, making him grit his teeth in pain. Haapala. Relief's here. A shout from platoon leader Olavi drifted over from the nearby bunker. The voice faded halfway across the empty snowfield, scattered by the wind before reaching Eero's ears. When Eero stood up, he found the heels of his canvas boots had frozen solid to the ankle-deep snow. He pulled hard, and ice shards fell from his soles, along with bits of dry grass. As he limped toward the bunker, he spotted fresh Arctic fox tracks in the snow, left by animals driven to desperation by the early winter, clearly heading for the grain store outside the bunker. The snow came earlier this year, Olavi said, handing him a tin cup of hot birch sap inside the bunker. The cup was so hot Eero had to switch hands. Heard the Soviets are massing on the border. A herdsman saw tanks yesterday, so many they looked like a herd of frozen iron oxen. Eero sipped the drink, it warmed his throat but not his stomach. He thought of the scarf his mother had tucked into his pack, still carrying the scent of home. 15 kilometers away, where Eero and Olavi talked of foxes, the Soviet Red Army's steel tide was mired in chaos. 1,500 BT-7 fast tanks, assigned to the 15th Tank Brigade of the Soviet 7th Army, lined the border, but these planes-designed vehicles were useless in meter-deep snow. Temperatures below -30°C caused their diesel engines to stall constantly, and their tracks were crusted with ice. Nearly a third of the tanks were stuck, soldiers had to tear down tent poles for crowbars and burn diesel to thaw the metal. Ivan Petrov, a 22-year-old Soviet soldier, squatted by a tank, cupping his hands over a bonfire. His cotton pants were worn through at the knees, and cold wind cut through, numbing his joints. "This place is 10 times colder than Ukraine," he complained to a veteran. The officer said Finns would surrender at the sight of tanks, but we're the ones freezing to death. The veteran said nothing, just buried a rock-hard loaf of black bread in the snow by the fire. Their field kitchens couldn't reach them, so this was the only way to soften the bread. No one dared speak loudly, only the crackle of diesel and howl of wind echoed. They waited for the attack signal, unaware it had been faked 48 hours earlier. On the evening of November 26, artillery fire erupted in the Soviet border village of Manila. 3 122mm shells hit a warehouse on the village edge, setting its thatched roof ablaze, so bright the glow reached a Soviet outpost 10 kilometers away. The gunners, from the 138th Soviet Infantry Division, had hidden their howitzers in nearby woods 3 days prior and evacuated most villagers. Only 65-year-old Grandma Ivanova refused to leave. Her husband was buried in the village cemetery, so she hid in a cellar with his photo, trembling as shells fell. After the attack, Soviet soldiers in Finnish grey uniforms scattered a dozen captured Finnish shell casings around the warehouse, planting evidence of a Finnish raid. The next morning, November 27, the Soviet Foreign Ministry sent a note to Finland, claiming Finnish troops attacked a border village, killing 3 civilians, then severed diplomatic ties. Arno Juhani Koskinen, Finland's ambassador to Moscow, tried to protest but was barred from the Kremlin. The Soviet official handling him tossed the note on the table. "The facts are clear. No need for further discussion." As Koskinen left the foreign ministry, snow fell on his top hat, veiling his humiliation. In the Kremlin's underground meeting room, Stalin stood before a giant map of Europe, his finger jabbing the Karelian Isthmus. The sheepskin map was frayed at the edges, his finger moved between Leningrad and Vyborg, cigar ash under his nails. Leningrad is only 32 kilometers from the border, he said, his voice quiet but firm. German tanks could strike from the west anytime. We must push the defense line north, this land belongs to the USSR. The generals stayed silent. Marshal Voroshilov, Commissar for Defense, held a troop report but didn't speak. It noted Finns were mostly hunters, loggers, and World War I veterans, while Soviet soldiers, mostly from the south, couldn't handle the cold. Finns know this snow, we need more time, Marshal Shaposhnikov, chief of the general staff, finally said. He'd fought Finns in 1918 and knew their white camouflage troops were deadly. Stalin waved him off, lighting a cigar. Time. We have 425,000 troops, they have 32,000 regulars, plus 48,000 first-wave reservists. We have 1,500 tanks, they have 32, 20 are World War I Renault FT-17s that can't even pierce our armor. What more time do we need? He exhaled smoke, obscuring Finland on the map. Attack on November 30th. Teach Finns the cost of resistance. At 8 p.m. on November 29th, Erik Sorensen, a 35-year-old Finnish radio operator, noticed chaos on the airwaves. Clear Swedish music was drowned out by static, faint Russian commands slipped through, dawn, breakthrough, Karelia. He scribbled notes, his pencil scraping loudly. He tried adjusting the frequency, but the static grew, mixed with Morse code beeps. Soviet jamming, he thought, grabbing the phone to alert Helsinki. The line was dead with noise. Just as he panicked, the static stopped. Music returned, as if nothing had happened. He stared at his notes, sweating. Dawn was surely the attack time. He called Helsinki again, this time it connected, but the response was dismissive. Border jamming's common. Stop overreacting. Erik looked out at the Soviet border, darker than usual, no bonfires, just silence. A beast lying in wait. Aero, now on guard, stared at that same silence. An unease gnawed at him, he gripped his rifle tighter. Wind carried distant tank engine roars, faint, but steady. He didn't know the ice field would soon shake with tank fire, and the scarf in his pack would soon be stained with snow and blood. Diplomatic coercion, the ultimatum in Moscow. On October 5, 1939, autumn snow had already fallen in Moscow, but the conference room of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was filled with an oppression sharper than the cold wind outside. Väinö Tanner, Finland's ambassador to the Soviet Union, sat on one side of the long wooden table, his fingers repeatedly brushing the leather folder in front of him. Inside was the territorial adjustment proposal, just handed over by the Soviet Union, its edges crumpled from his grip. Across from him, Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, puffed on a pipe, his eyes as sharp as a blade. Two military staff officers stood behind him, and a map spread out on the table marked the land the Soviet Union demanded in red, like a glaring scar. Mr. Tanner, Molotov exhaled a cloud of smoke that drifted before him. Leningrad security cannot be at any risk. The border on the Karelian Isthmus must be moved 40 kilometers north, this is our minimum requirement. He pointed the stem of his pipe at the Karelian Isthmus on the map, a region just 32 kilometers from Leningrad, where the red, new border line cut straight through several Finnish villages. Tanner picked up a magnifying glass and stared at the familiar place names on the map. His hometown lay on the outskirts of Vyborg, near the isthmus. If the border moved north, this land his family had inhabited for generations would be incorporated into the Soviet Union. Moving 40 kilometers means we lose 16,000 square kilometers of arable land and forests. Tanner's voice tightened, not to mention the outer defensive positions of Vyborg, the gateway to southeastern Finland. Molotov sneered, pulled another document from his drawer, and slid it to Tanner. As compensation, the Soviet Union is willing to hand over 27,000 square kilometers of wasteland northwest of Lake Onega. There are abundant timber resources there, enough to make up for your losses. Tanner picked up the document and scanned the description of the wasteland. He had visited that area before. it was marshland in summer and tundra in winter, barely cultivable and with no infrastructure, a world apart from the fertile Karelian Isthmus. This is not compensation, Comrade Commissar, Tanner set down the document firmly. Finland will not trade cultivable land for undevelopable swamps. When the negotiation reached an impasse, Molotov suddenly dropped his smile, his tone turning frigid. There is also the Hanko Peninsula. We need a 30-year lease to build a naval base. The Hanko Peninsula, shaped like a key at the entrance to the Gulf of Finland, controlled the waterway leading to the port of Helsinki. Tanner immediately realized the Soviet Union wanted more than a security buffer zone, it wanted to seize the throat of Finland's coastal defense. He retorted at once, the Hanko Peninsula is the core of Finland's coastal defense. Leasing it would mean Finland loses control of the Gulf of Finland. This is impossible to accept. Molotov rapped his knuckles on the table, and the staff officer behind him handed over an intelligence briefing. We have intelligence showing Germany is in contact with Finland. If Germany gains control of the Gulf of Finland, Leningrad will be directly exposed to German artillery. Do you want to become Germany's stepping stone? These words landed like a bomb, silencing Tanner. He knew the Soviet Union was using the German threat as a pretext to advance its expansionist agenda. That night, in the Finnish embassy in Moscow, Tanner sent an encrypted telegram to Helsinki, detailing the negotiation. The Soviet Union has adopted a tough stance, demanding 40 kilometers of territory on the Karelian Isthmus, a 30-year lease of the Hanko Peninsula, and offering wasteland northwest of Lake Onega as compensation. If we refuse, military risks are imminent. After sending the telegram, he stood at the window, watching Soviet soldiers patrol Moscow's streets, and knew Finland was already standing on the brink of war. Meanwhile, in the Prime Minister's office in Helsinki, Finland, a heated debate was underway. Prime Minister Risto Ryti held Tanner's telegram, his brows furrowed. The Soviet Union's demands are excessive. Ceding the Karelian Isthmus would make us lose 12% of our population and 20% of our industrial facilities. Defense Minister Juho Kusti Paasikivi, however, looked troubled, but our military strength is no match for the Soviet Union. The Soviets have already assembled 425,000 troops on the border, while our regular army has only 32,000 soldiers. Even if we mobilize reservists, we will have just 80,000 troops. We have only 32 tanks in total, 20 of which are Renault FT-17s from World War I, they don't even have armor-piercing shells. The door to the conference room suddenly opened, and Marshal Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, 68-year-old commander-in-chief of the Finnish Defense Forces, walked in. He wore a dark green military uniform, his chest covered with medals. A veteran of the Russo-Japanese War and World War I, he had just returned from inspecting the defensive fortifications on the Karelian Isthmus. I oppose any territorial concessions. Mannerheim laid a map on the table, marked in blue with the location of the Mannerheim Line. We have spent 10 years building this line, 330 concrete bunkers, 700 kilometers of anti-tank trenches, and dense barbed wire and minefields. As long as we mobilize enough troops, we can hold the isthmus. He pointed to the Hanko Peninsula on the map. We have coastal artillery positions there. If we hand it over to the Soviet Union, their warships can sail directly to the doorstep of Helsinki. We cannot give them that opportunity. Mannerheim's words quieted the conference room. He continued, the Soviet Union has many tanks, but their soldiers are not accustomed to fighting in snow. Our soldiers are mostly hunters and loggers, able to march in -30-degree snow. This is our advantage. He proposed continuing negotiations with the Soviet Union to buy time, accelerating reservist mobilization, and requesting military aid from Sweden and Norway. Finland's ammunition stockpile at the time could only last 3 months of combat, and it was in urgent need of rifles, machine guns, and anti-tank guns. In the Kremlin in Moscow, Stalin was holding a Politburo meeting to discuss Finland policy. The Finns refused to compromise, Molotov reported. Their Mannerheim is still strengthening defenses. It seems we need to resolve this with military means. Stalin nodded and picked up a troop deployment report. the 7th and 13th Armies of the Leningrad Military District have already assembled 425,000 troops, equipped with 1,500 tanks and 1,600 aircraft. They will complete all attack preparations by November 1st. He looked at Finland on the map, issue them an ultimatum, they must accept our terms by October 30th, otherwise we will launch an attack. On October 28, the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs summoned Tanner again and handed over the ultimatum. If Finland did not sign the territorial agreement by October 30th, the Soviet Union would take all necessary measures to ensure its own security. Tanner sent the ultimatum back to Helsinki, and the Finnish parliament held an emergency meeting. After 2 days of debate, it ultimately rejected the Soviet ultimatum with 143 votes against and 35 votes in favor. On October 30th, Tanner left Moscow and returned to Finland. He knew war was already inevitable. By this time, the Soviet Union's military deployment on the border had entered its final phase. More than 50 trains a day transported tanks, artillery, and soldiers to the border. The BT-7 tank columns of the 7th Army deployed on the Karelian Isthmus, and soldiers began practicing snow marches, only to find their cotton pants could not withstand -20-degree temperatures, and many men's noses ran from the cold. In Finland, meanwhile, reservist mobilization was in full swing. Eero Haapala, 21, received his enlistment notice during this period. He said goodbye to his parents, tucked the scarf his mother had knitted into his bag, and boarded the train to the Karelian Isthmus, unaware he was about to face one of the largest armies in the world. Steel-Tide, the frozen blitzkrieg. At 6 a.m. on November 30th, 1939, the first ray of dawn barely pierced the gray sky over the Karelian Isthmus when the ground suddenly trembled. Eero Haapala, huddled in a snow trench, felt the vibration travel up his boots, then came the distant rumble, growing louder like thunder rolling across the ice field. He gripped his Mosin-Nagant rifle with one hand and clutched a Molotov cocktail in the other. The glass bottle, filled with gasoline mixed with turpentine and capped with a rag soaked in kerosene, was cold enough to sting his palm. "Here they come!" Platoon leader Olavi's shout cut through the cold air. Eero poked his head out slightly from the trench, and his breath froze into a white mist the moment it left his mouth. In the distance, the snow horizon was dotted with dark shadows. Hundreds of Soviet BT-7 tanks advanced in a line, their tracks churning up snow and ice, while behind them, waves of Soviet infantry marched in formation, their bayonets glinting faintly in the dim light. This was the main attack force of the Soviet 7th Army, 120,000 troops, 800 tanks, and 400 artillery pieces, tasked with breaking through the Finnish defense line on the Karelian Isthmus in one fell swoop. But the steel tide that the Soviet High Command had counted on soon stumbled in the snow. A BT-7 tank at the front suddenly lurched to a stop, its diesel engine, unadapted to -30°C temperatures, stalled completely. The Soviet soldiers inside scrambled out, trying to restart it with a hand crank, but the metal crank was so cold it stuck to their gloves. Before they could fix the engine, a Finnish machine gun position 300 meters away opened fire. The bullets cut through the snow, hitting 2 soldiers in the legs, who fell into the snow and screamed in pain. "Wait for my signal!" Olavi yelled, his eyes fixed on the approaching tanks. Finland had only 32 tanks nationwide, and most of them were obsolete World War I models, so the soldiers had to rely on these homemade incendiary devices to fight armor. When the leading Soviet tank was 50 meters from the trench, close enough for Eero to see the red star painted on its turret, Olavi swung his arm down, throw. Eero pulled out a match, struck it against the trench wall, and lit the rag on the bottle. The flame flickered in the wind. He reared back and threw the Molotov cocktail with all his strength. The bottle arced through the air and hit the tank's tracks, shattering on impact. Gasoline mixed with turpentine burst into flames, wrapping around the metal tracks. The tank tried to reverse, but the burning fuel seeped into the engine compartment. Soon, black smoke billowed from the tank, and the crew inside rushed out, their uniforms on fire, rolling in the snow to put out the flames. All along the 20-kilometer defense line, Finnish soldiers threw Molotov cocktails at the Soviet tanks. These simple weapons, made from ordinary glass bottles, donated by Finnish civilians, and gasoline, rationed from local refineries, became a nightmare for the Soviet armor. By 10 a.m., the Finns had destroyed 17 Soviet tanks, most of them immobilized by fire, their tracks melted or engines burned out. But the Soviet Union's numerical advantage was overwhelming. Wave after wave of infantry charged forward, supported by artillery fire. A 122 mm artillery shell landed near Aero's trench, blowing snow and ice everywhere. He felt a sharp pain in his shoulder. Shrapnel had cut through his uniform, leaving a gash. "Hoppala, bandage it," a comrade shouted, tossing him a first aid kit. Aero tore off his glove with his teeth, pulled out a bandage, and wrapped it around his shoulder tightly. The blood soaked through the white cloth quickly, but he didn't have time to care. More Soviet soldiers were climbing over the snowbank in front of the trench. The battle raged until dusk. When the Soviet troops finally retreated to reorganize, the snow on the Karelian Isthmus was stained red. The Finns counted their losses, 800 soldiers killed or wounded. But the Soviet Union's casualties were far heavier. According to post-war Soviet military records, the 7th Army lost 3,000 troops and 35 tanks on the first day of the attack. That night, Aero sat in the trench, shivering from the cold and exhaustion. He took out the scarf his mother had knitted, now covered in snow and a little blood, and pressed it to his cheek. In the distance, he could see the glow of burning Soviet tanks, and hear the faint cries of wounded Soviet soldiers. Olavi walked over and patted his shoulder. "We held them back today. That's all that matters." But Aero knew this was just the beginning. The next morning, the Soviet artillery fire would be even more intense, and more tanks would charge forward. He picked up another glass bottle, filled it with gasoline and turpentine, and tied a rag around the neck, preparing for the next battle. The snow kept falling, covering the bloodstains on the ground, but it couldn't cover the determination in the Finnish soldiers' eyes. They would defend this ice field, even if it cost them their lives. The backbone of defense, Mannerheim's shield. On December 10, 1939, the Karelian Isthmus was enveloped in a bone-chilling cold of -32 degrees Celsius. Marshal Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim stood atop a concrete bunker of the Mannerheim Line, his binoculars scanning the snow-covered battlefield ahead. The wind ruffled the edges of his military coat, and frost had formed on his eyebrows, but his gaze remained sharp, fixed on the Soviet troop positions 5 kilometers away. Behind him, the Mannerheim Line, Finland's last line of defense on the isthmus, stretched 130 kilometers from the Gulf of Finland to Lake Ladoga, like an unyielding iron shield. This line of defense, built over 10 years with 330 reinforced concrete bunkers, 700 kilometers of anti-tank trenches, and dense layers of barbed wire and minefields, was far more solid than the Soviet High Command had anticipated. Each bunker was embedded 1.5 meters deep in the frozen soil, with walls 80 centimeters thick, able to withstand direct hits from 122 mm artillery shells. Inside the bunkers, Finnish soldiers operated 76 mm anti-tank guns and Maxim machine guns, their positions hidden by snow-covered camouflage nets that blended seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. "The Soviets think they can break through here in 3 days, Mannerheim said to General Hugo Osterman, commander of Finland's Second Army, standing beside him. "But they forgot, this land is ours, and we know how to fight for it." At that moment, the distant roar of Soviet artillery echoed across the field. A shell landed 200 meters from the bunker, kicking up a fountain of snow and ice, but the bunker itself remained unscathed. In bunker number 17, nicknamed Grey Wolf Bunker by Finnish soldiers, 24-year-old gunner Eero Koskinen sat behind a 76 mm anti-tank gun, his gloved hands resting lightly on the firing lever. The bunker's observation post had just reported, a column of 30 Soviet T-26 tanks was advancing toward their position, followed by 2 battalions of infantry. "Load armor-piercing rounds," Eero shouted to his assistant, who quickly slid a 76 mm round into the breech. When the leading T-26 tank entered the 800-meter range, within the effective firing distance of the anti-tank gun, Eero yelled, "Fire!" The gun roared, and the shell streaked through the cold air, hitting the tank's turret dead on. The tank's armor, only 15 millimeters thick, was easily penetrated. A flash of fire erupted from the turret and smoke billowed out. The Soviet soldiers inside bailed out in a panic, only to be cut down by the bunker's machine gun fire. By noon, the Grey Wolf bunker had destroyed 8 Soviet tanks and inflicted over 200 casualties on enemy infantry. But the Soviet attack showed no sign of stopping. Wave after wave of soldiers charged forward, using shovels to fill anti-tank trenches with snow and ice, trying to clear a path for the tanks. Finnish soldiers in the bunker fought back with everything they had, throwing hand grenades through the bunker's firing ports, using machine guns to mow down advancing infantry, and even firing rifles at close range when the enemy got too near. The battle for the Mannerheim Line raged for 18 consecutive days. The Soviet 7th Army, with 120,000 troops and 800 tanks, launched dozens of large-scale assaults, but each time was repelled by the Finnish defenders, who numbered only 40,000. The Soviet Union suffered heavy losses. By December 28, over 15,000 Soviet soldiers had been killed or wounded, and 120 tanks had been destroyed or captured. In contrast, Finland's casualties were around 300. One key reason for Finland's success was the line's design, which took full advantage of the isthmus's terrain. Anti-tank trenches were dug along natural ridges, forcing Soviet tanks to climb exposed slopes where they became easy targets. Minefields, laid at a density of 50 mines per 100 meters, destroyed many tanks before they even reached the trenches. Additionally, Finnish soldiers, familiar with the local snow and forest terrain, often sneaked behind Soviet lines at night to launch raids, destroying artillery positions and cutting off supply routes. On the night of December 28, Eero Koskinen leaned against the bunker wall, eating a hard piece of black bread. Outside, the wind howled, and the distant glow of burning Soviet tanks lit up the sky. "Do you think we can hold this line forever?" his assistant asked, his voice tired. Eero looked at the 76mm anti-tank gun, now covered in a thin layer of frost, and nodded. "As long as we're here, this line won't break. It's Mannerheim's shield, and we're the steel in it." Mannerheim, meanwhile, was inspecting a reserve position behind the line. He met with soldiers, patted them on the shoulders, and reminded them, "The Soviet Union has more soldiers and tanks, but we have something they don't: we're fighting for our homes. Every meter of this land is worth our lives." His words boosted the soldiers' morale. Even though they were exhausted and short on supplies, their determination to defend the line never wavered. The Mannerheim Line, once dismissed by the Soviet High Command as a flimsy dirt wall, had become a nightmare for the Red Army. For nearly a month, it stood firm against the Soviet steel tide, proving that with proper fortifications, terrain advantage, and unyielding morale, a smaller army could hold off a much larger one. And for the Finnish people, the line was more than just a fortification. It was a symbol of their resistance, a testament to their will to protect their homeland. The White Death, the legend of the sniper. At 9 a.m. on December 15, 1939, the temperature in the Suomi-Salmi region of northern Finland plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius. Simo Haiha, a 34-year-old Finnish sniper, lay motionless in a snowdrift, his body wrapped in a white camouflage suit that blended perfectly with the surrounding snow. Only the barrel of his Mosin-Nagant M/28-30 rifle, without an optical scope, modified with an iron sight for better concealment, protruded slightly from the snow, its metal surface covered with a thin layer of frost to avoid reflecting light. Haiha's breathing was slow and shallow, each breath forming tiny ice crystals the moment it left his lips. He had been lying here for 3 hours, waiting for his target. As a former hunter from the Karelian region, he knew how to survive in the extreme cold. He wore 3 layers of woolen underwear, stuffed moss into his boots to keep warm, and held a small piece of ice in his mouth to prevent his breath from forming too much white mist, all little tricks that helped him stay hidden from Soviet patrols. Movement at 800 meters, his spotter, Corporal Lauri Torni, whispered in a voice barely audible. Haiha slowly adjusted the iron sight of his rifle, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the distant figure. A Soviet soldier, carrying a rifle and a canvas bag of rations, walked out of the forest, his steps heavy in the deep snow. He was part of the Soviet 163rd Infantry Division, which had been advancing slowly in the Suomi-Salmi region, unaware that death was lurking in the snow nearby. Haiha took a deep breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle made a low, muffled sound. He had wrapped a cloth around the muzzle to reduce noise. The bullet flew through the cold air, hitting the Soviet soldier in the chest. The soldier fell forward into the snow without a sound, his rifle slipping from his hand. Torny quickly marked the position with a small stick. That's 512. Haiha nodded slightly. This was his 512th confirmed kill since the start of the war. What made Haiha's sniping so deadly was his mastery of the terrain and cold. He often dug snow caves to hide, staying inside for up to 12 hours at a time, waiting for the right moment. He preferred to shoot at targets 400 to 800 meters away, within the effective range of his iron-sighted rifle, but far enough that the enemy could not easily locate his position. The extreme cold also helped. The low temperature slowed down the speed of sound, making it harder for Soviet soldiers to determine the direction of the gunshot. By late December, Haiha's name had become a source of fear for the Soviet troops in Suomi-Salmi. They called him the White Death and offered a reward of 500,000 Finnish marks for his capture, equivalent to the annual salary of 20 Soviet soldiers at the time. To counter him, the Soviet Union sent in their own elite snipers, but most were killed by Haiha before they could spot him. On December 27, Haiha encountered his most dangerous opponent, a Soviet sniper equipped with a Mosin-Nagant rifle with a 3.5x optical scope. The Soviet sniper had taken up position in a pine tree 600 meters away, using the tree's branches for cover. Torny spotted the glint of the scope first, sniper in the pine tree at 10 o'clock. Haiha rolled to the side, just as a bullet hit the snow where his head had been a second earlier. He crawled into a nearby snow cave, then slowly peeked out, scanning the trees. He noticed a small movement in the pine tree's branches. The Soviet sniper was adjusting his scope. Haiha quickly calculated the wind speed and distance, then fired. The bullet hit the Soviet sniper in the shoulder, causing him to fall from the tree. When Finnish soldiers later checked the body, they found a photo of the sniper's family in his pocket. He was only 22 years old. The legend of the White Death spread beyond the Suomi-Salmi battlefield. By January 1940, Haiha had recorded 542 confirmed kills, a record that still stands as the highest number of confirmed sniper kills in a single war. But he was not the only Finnish sniper making an impact. The Finnish Army's sniper units, made up mostly of former hunters and lumberjacks, accounted for over 3,000 Soviet casualties during the war, about 10% of the total Soviet losses on the Northern Front. On January 6, 1940, Haiha was on a sniping mission near the Kala River when disaster struck. A Soviet soldier threw a fragmentation grenade near his position. The blast hit him in the face, and a piece of shrapnel penetrated his left cheek, damaging his left eye. Torny dragged him to safety, and Haiha was rushed to a field hospital, then transferred to Helsinki Central Hospital for surgery. The doctors had to remove his left eye, but he survived. His sniping career, however, was over. When Haiha woke up in the hospital, the first thing he asked was, "How's the front?" Torny, who had come to visit him, told him, "The boys are still fighting. And everyone knows about the White Death. You've given us all courage." Haiha smiled faintly. He didn't care about the fame. For him, he was just doing what he could to protect his homeland, the same way he had protected his family's forest from poachers years ago. The legend of Simo Haiha lived on long after the Winter War. His story became a symbol of Finnish resilience, how an ordinary hunter, using simple tools and deep knowledge of his land, could stand against a powerful army. And for the Soviet troops who fought in the frozen forests of Finland, the name, the White Death, remained a haunting memory of the winter of 1939 to 1940. Leadership change and reinforcements, Timoshenko's onslaught. On January 7, 1940, the Kremlin's conference room was filled with a tense atmosphere. Joseph Stalin stared at the battle map spread across the long table. his finger tapping heavily on the red-marked Karelian Isthmus, where the Soviet 7th Army had been bogged down for over a month, failing to break through the Finnish Mannerheim Line. The offensive is a disaster. Stalin slammed his fist on the table, his voice sharp with anger. 15,000 casualties and 120 tanks lost, yet we haven't even seized a single bunker. We need a new commander, someone who can get results. The name he uttered next was Semyon Timoshenko, a veteran general who had distinguished himself in the Spanish Civil War. That same day, Timoshenko was summoned to Moscow and appointed commander-in-chief of the Soviet forces on the Finnish front. His first order was clear: assemble all available reinforcements and launch a full-scale offensive within 10 days. The Mannerheim Line must be broken by the end of January. By January 15, the Soviet Union had poured massive reinforcements into the Karelian Isthmus. The total strength of the Soviet forces there jumped from 120,000 to 166,000 troops, with tank numbers increasing from 800 to 2,000, including 500 newly deployed T-28 medium tanks, which had thicker armor than the earlier BT-7s. Artillery pieces were reinforced from 400 to 1,200, and 800 additional IL-4 bombers and I-16 fighters were deployed to gain air superiority. These reinforcements were mostly drawn from the Ural Military District and Siberian Military District, troops more accustomed to cold weather, though few had actual combat experience. Timoshenko's tactics were brutal and straightforward. First, use intensive artillery bombardment to destroy Finnish bunkers and minefields, then, send waves of tanks to break through the anti-tank trenches, finally, deploy infantry to occupy the breached positions and expand the offensive. On January 20, at 6 a.m., the offensive began with a 4-hour artillery barrage. Over 300,000 shells were fired at the 20-kilometer-wide northern section of the Mannerheim Line, turning the snow-covered battlefield into a sea of fire and smoke. Eero Haapala, who had been transferred to the northern section of the Mannerheim Line a week earlier, huddled in a temporary trench, his ears ringing from the continuous artillery fire. The snow around him was mixed with soil and shrapnel. Several of his comrades had been buried under the collapsed snow, their screams drowned out by the explosions. "Hold on!" Olavi, now promoted to company commander, shouted, patting Eero on the shoulder. "The artillery will stop soon, then the tanks will come." Olavi was right. At 10 a.m., the artillery fire ceased, and the ground began to tremble. Hundreds of Soviet T-28 tanks advanced in a tight formation, their tracks flattening the snow and crushing the remains of barbed wire. Behind them, Soviet infantry marched in dense rows, holding their rifles high. This time, the Soviets had a new weapon: snow plows, mounted on the front of tanks, used to clear minefields and fill anti-tank trenches with snow. The Finnish defenders fought back fiercely. Eero Koskinen, in bunker number 17, fired his 76mm anti-tank gun at the approaching tanks, but the T-28's 30mm thick armor proved harder to penetrate. Several shells bounced off, leaving only shallow dents. "Use high-explosive rounds," Eero yelled. The next shell hit a tank's engine compartment, causing it to catch fire, but more tanks kept coming. By noon, the Soviets had breached a 1.5-kilometer section of the Mannerheim Line. Finnish soldiers launched counterattacks, using Molotov cocktails and anti-tank rifles to destroy enemy tanks, while snipers picked off Soviet infantry. Eero charged forward with a group of comrades, throwing hand grenades at a group of Soviet soldiers who had occupied a Finnish bunker. The battle was fierce. Hand-to-hand combat broke out in the snow, with soldiers using bayonets, shovels, and even their fists. The offensive lasted for 5 days. By January 25, the Soviets had expanded the breach to 5 kilometers and captured 12 Finnish bunkers, but at a heavy cost. Over 12,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or wounded, and 87 tanks were destroyed. Finland's losses were also significant: 2,300 casualties and 3 bunkers completely destroyed. Timoshenko was not satisfied. He ordered more reinforcements to be sent to the breach, determined to widen it further. On January 26, he visited the front line, standing in a command post 2 kilometers from the battlefield, watching the tanks advance. "We will break through this line in 3 days," he told his staff. "No matter how many men we lose, we must win." The Finnish defenders, meanwhile, were running out of supplies. Ammunition for anti-tank guns was nearly exhausted, and many soldiers had not eaten hot food in 3 days. Mannerheim visited the front on January 27, seeing the exhausted soldiers and the damaged bunkers. "We have fought bravely," he said to his officers, "but the enemy has more men and more weapons. We must prepare for a strategic retreat if the line is completely breached." That night, Eero sat in a damaged bunker, sharing a piece of hard black bread with a comrade. Outside, the sound of Soviet artillery fire could still be heard, and the glow of burning tanks lit up the sky. "Do you think we can stop them?" the comrade asked, his voice tired. Eero looked at his Mosin-Nagant rifle, now covered in snow and blood, and nodded, "We'll keep fighting, for our homes, for our families." But deep down, Eero knew the truth. The Mannerheim Line, once an unbreakable shield, was now showing cracks. With Timoshenko's massive reinforcements and relentless attacks, it was only a matter of time before the line fell. The question was not if, but when, and how many more lives would be lost before then. Isolated aid and compromise, the diplomatic battle on the ice field. In the early morning of December 2, 1939, the rapid beeping of a telegraph machine cut through the silence in the telegraph room of Finland's Ministry of Defense in Helsinki. Leena Koski, a 28-year-old telegrapher, had read, chapped fingertips from the cold, but she stared fixedly at the coded tape. This was an urgent aid request telegram from Gustav Åström, Finland's ambassador to Sweden, and she had to decode it and deliver it to Prime Minister Risto Ryyti's office within 10 minutes. Prime Minister Hansen of Sweden has agreed to limited aid but refuses to send regular troops, only allowing volunteers to go to Finland. The decoded message made Leena gasp. She wrapped her woolen coat tightly around her, rushed through the snow to the Prime Minister's office, her boots slipping on the icy flagstones. She knew the soldiers on the front line were waiting for this life-saving news. Meanwhile, in Stockholm, Sweden, Ambassador Åström had just walked out of the Prime Minister's office, with snowflakes swirling around his top hat. Prime Minister Hansen's words still echoed in his ears: "Sweden cannot be drawn into war because of Finland. Volunteers are the limit of what we can do, and they must remove all Swedish military insignia." Behind the Prime Minister lay a fierce debate in the Swedish Parliament. When the Parliament voted on aid to Finland, in November 1939, 58% of MPs opposed direct military intervention, fearing the Soviet Union would use this as an excuse to attack Sweden. The final size of the volunteer force was set at 8,700, mostly reservists from the Swedish Army, including 3 infantry battalions, 2 artillery companies, and light equipment, 24 60mm mortars, with a rate of fire of 15 rounds per minute and an effective range of 1,800 meters. 127.92mm machine guns, and 12,000 Mauser 98K rifles. On December 5, the first batch of 2,000 volunteers gathered in Haparanda in northern Sweden. They took off their Swedish military uniforms, put on Finnish grey uniforms, and crossed the frozen Torna River on sleds to reach Rovaniemi, Finland. By then, ice had formed on every volunteer's eyelashes, and their boots were filled with snow. At the same time, Olof Palme, Finland's ambassador to the United Kingdom, sat in the drawing room of 10, Downing Street in London, staring at the aid commitment letter handed to him by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, unable to smile. The letter stated that the UK will provide 156 fighter aircraft, including 120 Spitfire Mki and 36 Hurricane Mki, but when Palme pressed for when they would arrive in Finland, Chamberlain hesitated. He knew most of these aircraft were still being assembled in Coventry factories, and the transportation route was a fatal problem. The aircraft had to be shipped to Bergen, Norway, then to Stockholm, Sweden, and finally transported to Finland by rail. However, both countries, under pressure from Germany, refused to open transit channels for British equipment. On December 12, the first batch of 30 Spitfire Mki aircraft arrived in Bergen Harbour, but Norwegian customs detained them in the port warehouse on the grounds of no government transit permission. The German ambassador to Norway even visited the Norwegian foreign minister, threatening that Germany will re-evaluate its relations with Norway if it allows British equipment to transit. In a telegram to Helsinki, Palm wrote helplessly, "The commitment is like a castle in the air, visible but unreachable." French aid also hit a dead end. On December 8, 1939, French War Minister Édouard Daladier announced that France will provide Finland with 80 25mm SA-34 anti-tank guns and 12,000 armor-piercing rounds. This anti-tank gun was France's main equipment at the time, capable of penetrating 30 mm thick armor at a distance of 500 meters, which was just enough to deal with the Soviet BT-7 tanks, with armor thickness of 15 to 22 millimeters. However, when France tried to ship the equipment to Finland via the Baltic Sea, German Navy U-boats began patrolling the Baltic Sea. French merchant ships had to detour around the North Sea, extending the voyage from 5 days to 12 days, and were repeatedly tracked by German reconnaissance aircraft. On December 20, the French merchant ship Lafayette, carrying 20 anti-tank guns, was spotted by a German U-boat in the North Sea. Although it narrowly escaped, it had to return to Le Havre, France, and did not reach Finland until January 1940. By then, the shortage of anti-tank guns on the Finnish front had widened to 150. The League of Nations' solidarity was more like a political spectacle. On December 14, 1939, in the conference hall of the League of Nations headquarters in Geneva, representatives of 42 countries held up blue ballots and voted to confirm that the Soviet Union had launched an aggressive war against Finland. Among them, Western European countries such as the UK, France, and Belgium all voted in favor. The Soviet Union, Mongolia, and Afghanistan voted against. 7 countries including the US, Norway, and Sweden abstained. The US abstained because it still implemented the Neutrality Acts and was unwilling to be drawn into the European war. Norway and Sweden abstained for fear of angering the Soviet Union and affecting their neutral status. When the League of Nations president announced that the Soviet Union would be expelled from the League of Nations, Maxim Litvinov, head of the Soviet delegation, stood up and slammed the door. Before leaving, he left a remark: "The League of Nations is just a puppet of Britain and France. The Soviet Union security does not need your interference." This sanction had no substantial impact on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union continued to deploy troops from Siberia, and in January 1940, an additional 150,000 troops and 500 tanks were sent to the Soviet-Finnish border. On March 8, 1940, the cold wave in Moscow was harsher than usual, and the heating in the hotel where the Finnish delegation stayed was broken. Väinö Tanner, the head of the delegation, wrapped himself in a thick coat, staring at the ultimatum handed over by the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs, his hands trembling with anger. The ultimatum demanded that Finland cede 23,000 more square kilometers of territory than before, including the entire Karelian Isthmus, including Viborg, Finland's second-largest city, the Salla region, the Rybaki Peninsula, and a 30-year lease on the Hanko Peninsula. At the same time, Finland had to pay 150 million Finnish marks, equivalent to $40 million at the time, accounting for 18% of Finland's 1939 fiscal revenue. Major General Albin Ekström, a member of the delegation and chief of staff of the Finnish Defence Forces, couldn't help but slam the table. Viborg is Finland's industrial center. Losing it will reduce our steel production by 40%. Tanner, however, remained silent. He had just received a frontline telegram. On March 7, the Soviet 7th Army had captured Viborg, and tank columns were advancing along the Viborg-Helsinki highway, only 120 kilometers away from the capital. The Finnish army's ammunition stockpile could only last 3 days of combat. At 2 a.m. on March 12, the negotiations ended in the building of the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs. When Tanner signed the peace treaty, his pen failed to write several times, his hands were frozen, and his heart was cold. The treaty stipulated that Finland would cede a total of 192,000 square kilometers of territory, 11.5% of the country's total territory, and 220,000 local civilians had to relocate to inland Finland within 3 months. Among these civilians were Eero Hoppala's parents. They set off from Varkaus village on the Karelian Isthmus, pulling simple belongings on sleds, and marched toward Tampere along the icy road. Many elderly people and children fell behind due to the severe cold. Haapala was on standby at a position on the outskirts of Helsinki at the time. When he heard the news that his hometown had been sieged, he buried his face in the snow, his shoulders trembling, and the scarf knitted by his mother, still carrying the scent of home, was tucked in his arms. On the day of the signing, Tanner wrote in his diary, "Today's compromise is a humiliation, but also a necessity. We have lost land, but we have preserved the country's independence. As long as the country exists, one day we will take back what we have lost." On the streets of Moscow, Soviet citizens held up slogans to celebrate the victory, but no one knew that the war had cost the Soviet Union 320,000 casualties. Although Finland was defeated, its tenacious resistance won respect from the international community. Sweden, Switzerland, and other countries later provided Finland with a reconstruction loan of 230 million Swiss francs to help Finland resettle the relocated civilians. The eternal mark of snow, the aftermath of the war. In the early morning of March 6, 1940, the snow on the Suomussalmi battlefield of the Karelian Isthmus had reached knee-deep, and the temperature of -38 degrees Celsius had turned the air into a solid-like cold. Simo Haiha, a Finnish sniper, lay motionless in the snow, his white camouflage suit blending perfectly with the surrounding snowfield. Only his eyes, visible beneath his goggles, scanned the area vigilantly. He had just shot and killed a company commander of the Soviet 163rd Infantry Division at a distance of 1,000 meters, and the scale on his rifle stock still stayed at the 1,000 mark. Just as he was about to move his position, a burst of rapid artillery whistles passed over his head. He instinctively curled up his body, but was still thrown to the ground by the shock wave of a fragmentation grenade. Haiha! Haiha! His comrade, Esa Lantinen, crawled over under fire. When his fingers touched Simo's cheek, he felt a sticky warmth. Shrapnel had pierced his left cheek, exited below his cheekbone, and severely damaged his left eye. Blood mixed with snow water froze into an ice crust on his camouflage suit. Esa untied his first aid kit and pressed a bandage tightly against the wound, but the blood still seeped out continuously. They hid behind the wreckage of a destroyed tank, and Soviet machine guns were still firing nearby. Esa had to carry Simo on his back and trudge through the snow that reached his waist. It took them a full 3 hours to cover a distance that usually only took 20 minutes. When they reached the rear medical station, Simo's body temperature had dropped to 32 degrees Celsius, and he fell into a deep coma. The medical station was a 12-square-meter wooden house, crowded with 8 wounded soldiers. The only stove burned damp birch wood, and the smoke was so choking that it made people's eyes water. Dr. Karl Koch cut open Simo's camouflage suit with scissors, and gasped when he saw the wound. "The shrapnel is only 1 centimeter away from the carotid artery, surviving this is a miracle." Without professional ophthalmic equipment, Koch could only use morphine to relieve the pain. It was not until 3 days later, when Simo was transferred to Helsinki Central Hospital, that doctors had to remove his damaged left eye. When he woke up, Simo touched the bandage on his face. The first question he asked was not about his injury, but, "How is the situation on the front line?" He still didn't know that the Soviet army had already captured Viborg, and the Finnish government was preparing to sign a peace agreement in Moscow. Meanwhile, Finnish soldier Eero Haapala retreated with his troops from Viborg to the outskirts of Helsinki, and received a letter from his hometown of Varkaus village. The letter was written by his neighbor, Aunt Maria, in a shaky handwriting. "The village has been incorporated into Soviet territory. Your parents have taken your sister to Tampere. They encountered a snowstorm on the way, and your father's foot was frozen, so he can only walk with a stick." Eero clutched the letter, his fingers turning white from the force. He thought of the logging knife his father had given him before he left, which was still hanging at his waist, and the wood grain on the scabbard was still polished by his father's hands. In April 1940, Eero finally got a 3-day leave. He took 3 trains and 2 sleds before finding his family in a temporary resettlement camp in Tampere. His parents lived in a simple wooden house built with planks, with cracks all over the walls. Cold wind poured in through the cracks, and his sister Lena was roasting potatoes by a small stove. When she saw Eero, she threw herself into his arms and cried, "Brother, our home is gone." The resettlement camp was crowded with 220,000 civilians, accounting for 5% of Finland's total population, who had migrated from the Karelian Isthmus. Most of them could only live in wooden houses or tents, and were given a daily ration of 200 grams of black bread and a cup of birch sap. Eero's father sat in the corner, his feet wrapped in thick cloth strips. When he saw Eero, he took out a cloth bag from his arms, which contained the woolen hat Eero had worn as a child. "We didn't bring most of the things from home. You keep this, it's a memory at least." Eero took the hat and touched the fluff inside. He suddenly remembered the scene when his father took him to hunt hares in the forest when he was a child. Tears couldn't help but fall, landing on the hat and quickly turning into small ice beads. Time flew to June 4, 1960. In Mannerheim Square in central Helsinki, the sun broke through the clouds and shone on the newly completed monument. This 10-meter-high bronze monument had the war years, 1939 to 1940, engraved on its base, and the words, "Dedicated to the heroes who fought for independence," inscribed on the front in Finnish and Swedish. The back was densely covered with the names of 70,000 Finnish casualties, including 25,000 dead and 45,000 wounded. These names were verified one by the Finnish government over 5 years, using military archives and local government record. At the unveiling ceremony, 83-year-old Marshal Mannerheim attended in a wheelchair. He wore a neat military uniform, with medals covering his chest, including Finland's highest honor, the Cross of Liberty. Facing thousands of veterans in the audience, Mannerheim's voice was slightly trembling but still powerful. "In the winter of 1939, we fought against tanks with rifles and Molotov cocktails, and against steel with courage. We lost 192,000 square kilometers of land, but we preserved the country's independence. This spirit of resistance is more precious than any territory." He paused and scanned the veterans in the audience. "I still remember that in the Battle of Suomussalmi, soldiers lurked in the snow for 3 days and nights just to blow up a Soviet tank. I still remember the defenders of the Hanko Peninsula, who only retreated when they ran out of ammunition and food. You are all Finland's pride." In the crowd, 62-year-old Simo Haiha wore a black eye patch and held his old Mosin-Nagant rifle, whose stock had been polished smooth. Beside him stood 61-year-old Eero Haapala, holding the logging knife left by his father. When Marshal Mannerheim finished his last sentence, Simo raised his rifle and saluted the monument with a still standard posture. Even though he had only one eye, he remembered every comrade who died on the battlefield, their faces, and the words they had said. The impact of the Winter War extended far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union and Finland. Although the Soviet Union gained a security buffer zone through the war, the problems exposed by the war were noticed by Nazi Germany. In May 1940, a report submitted by the German Military Observation Group pointed out that the Soviet Red Army had problems such as rigid command, equipment incompatible with snow combat, and chaotic logistics supply. During the Winter War alone, the Soviet Union lost 320,000 troops and 1,500 tanks. Hitler clearly stated at a military meeting in July 1940, "The combat effectiveness of the Soviet Red Army is far weaker than we imagined. Their performance in Finland proves that we can defeat them within 6 months." This judgment directly influenced the formulation of Operation Barbarossa in 1941 and laid the groundwork for the Soviet Union's early defeats in World War II. After the Winter War, Finland began a decades-long national preparation for war. In June 1941, Finland allied with Germany and launched the Continuation War, in an attempt to regain lost territory. It was finally defeated again in 1944 and forced to sign the Moscow Armistice, ceding another 4,400 square kilometers of territory and paying $300 million in war reparations. It was not until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 that Finland and Russia redefined their border and completely resolved the territorial dispute. On April 1, 2002, 96-year-old Simo Haiha passed away at his home in Helsinki. At his funeral, the Finnish military fired a 21-gun salute, the highest military honor. Among the veterans who came to pay their respects was Eero Haapala, who held the scope Simo had used on the battlefield. Simo had given it to Aero in 1960, and Simo's fingerprints were still on it. Aero placed the scope on Simo's coffin and whispered, "Hiha, we will remember you, and all those who fought for Finland." Today, in the Winter War exhibition area of the Finnish War Museum, Simo Hiha's Mosinagant rifle and black eye patch, the logging knife left by Eero Haapala's father, and the sleds and kettles used by 220,000 displaced civilians are all displayed in glass cabinets. On the screen above the exhibition cabinet, old battlefield images play in a loop, Finnish soldiers in white camouflage suits lurking in the snow, Molotov cocktails streaking through the night sky and hitting Soviet tanks, and displaced civilians pulling sleds and moving forward in the snow. Every visitor stops here, looking at these items that carry the warmth of history, as if they can hear the howling cold wind of the winter of 1939 and feel the courage and perseverance of those who fought for independence. Snow may melt, but history will never be forgotten, and the scars engraved on the land will eventually become an indelible memory of a nation.